The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the seats, cameras flashing as the judge entered. It wasn't every day that a high-profile case like this landed in his courtroom, and the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. But sitting at the defendant's table, completely unbothered by the weight of the moment, was Ethan Sinclair, the young, spoiled heir to a billionaire fortune. Dressed in an overpriced designer suit, he leaned back in his chair with a smug grin, barely paying attention as the case against him was presented. To Ethan, this whole thing was nothing more than a joke. He had grown up knowing that money could solve any problem. A speeding ticket, paid off, a bar fight, settled out of court. Even when he wrecked his sports car into a storefront last summer, his father's lawyers made it disappear like it never happened. He had never faced real consequences in his life, and today, he was sure this was just another inconvenience that his name and wealth would erase. The judge, however, wasn't amused. Judge Matthews was a man who had seen it all: hardened criminals, corporate fraud, families torn apart by greed. But something about Ethan's sheer arrogance struck a nerve. As the hearing began, Ethan barely looked up from his phone, tapping away as if he were bored at a long dinner party. When the judge addressed him, he didn't stand, didn't even try to act respectful. Instead, he smirked and muttered under his breath, "This is such a waste of time." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor, a sharp and relentless woman named Miss Caldwell, didn't even have to say anything. Ethan was digging his own grave, but he didn't seem to care. He rolled his eyes, let out an exaggerated yawn, and even laughed when his own lawyer whispered for him to behave. Judge Matthews watched him carefully. There was something deeply unsettling about the way Ethan carried himself, like the entire world was beneath him. The judge had dealt with entitled defendants before, but Ethan's complete lack of remorse was something else. Then the breaking point came. When asked to make a statement, Ethan sighed dramatically and leaned into the microphone. "Look, let's be real here. I could buy this entire courtroom if I wanted to. So can we just skip this little show and tell me what fine I have to pay?" Silence. Absolute silence. Even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably. The judge stared at Ethan for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, in a calm voice, he said, "Mr. Sinclair, I don't think you understand the gravity of your situation." Ethan just smirked. "Oh, I get it, Your Honor. You're trying to teach me a lesson. But let's be honest, my dad's lawyers are going to handle this, and I'll be back on my yacht by the weekend." Another wave of murmurs spread through the room. Even his own legal team looked horrified. But Ethan? He was enjoying himself. To him, this was entertainment, just another story to laugh about over drinks later. Judge Matthews sat back, his fingers steepled. Then he made a decision, one that no one in the room saw coming. He picked up his gavel, gave a single sharp knock, and delivered a sentence so shocking, so unexpected, that even Ethan's smug expression finally disappeared. The entire courtroom erupted, people whispering, reporters scrambling to take notes. Ethan's jaw dropped. For the first time in his privileged life, reality hit him like a freight train. And in that moment, as the weight of his sentence sank in, it was clear: Ethan Sinclair's life was about to change forever. Ethan Sinclair blinked, his usual cocky expression faltering for the first time. His mouth opened slightly as if he was about to protest, but nothing came out. The weight of the judge's words hadn't fully settled in, and for the first time in his life, he was at a complete loss for words. His father's high-powered attorneys, who had been sitting stiffly at the defense table, suddenly looked uneasy. They had handled countless cases for the Sinclair family before, usually making problems disappear before they ever reached a courtroom. But this time, something was different. This time, Judge Matthews wasn't playing by the usual rules. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom, reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks, camera shutters clicking. People leaned in, trying to process what had just happened. Even Miss Caldwell, the prosecutor, raised an eyebrow. She had hoped for a firm ruling, but this was something else entirely. Ethan shook his head as if trying to shake off a bad dream. "Wait, what?" he finally said, his voice unsteady. "That's not." Judge Matthews lifted a hand, silencing him before he could finish. His expression remained calm, but his eyes held an unshakable authority. "Mr. Sinclair, I suggest you listen carefully before you speak." His voice was steady, firm, the kind that could quiet a room without needing to be raised. Ethan clenched his jaw, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. The confidence he had strutted into the courtroom with was slipping, and he didn't know how to get it back. His whole life, he had been able to talk his way out of things, or at least pay his way out. But the way the judge was looking at him now, it was clear that neither was going to work this time. His lawyer, Mr. Carlyle, cleared his throat and leaned in close, whispering something urgent in Ethan's ear. But Ethan barely heard him. His mind was racing. How could this be happening? His father was in the front row, dressed in an expensive suit that probably cost more than most people made in a year. Mr. Sinclair Sr. was a man who commanded power wherever he went. But at this moment, even he seemed unable to mask his concern. His jaw was set, his fingers interlocked tightly, but he remained silent. He was the type to handle things behind closed doors, to make strategic moves without making a scene. And yet, for the first time in a long time, he looked like he wasn't in control. Ethan turned his attention back to the judge, heart pounding. "Your Honor, with all due respect." The judge's expression didn't change. "Mr. Sinclair, respect is not something you sprinkle into your words when it's convenient. It's something you show through your actions. And from where I'm sitting, I've seen none." A few people in the courtroom nodded slightly, as if they had been waiting for someone to finally say it. Ethan swallowed hard. He wanted to argue, to fight back, to say something clever that would turn the situation back in his favor. But for the first time, nothing came to mind. The judge continued, his voice steady. "For too long, you've walked into courtrooms expecting to leave without consequences. You've treated the legal system like a minor inconvenience, something that can be handled with a checkbook and a handshake. But not today." Ethan's pulse quickened. He glanced at his father again, searching for some kind of reassurance, but his father remained still, his expression unreadable. The judge let the silence hang for a moment before continuing. "You don't understand what it means to be held accountable, Mr. Sinclair, but you will." The weight of those words pressed down on Ethan like a heavy stone. His breathing grew shallow. He had expected a fine, maybe a slap on the wrist. But this felt different. His mind flashed back to the night that had led him here. The flashing city lights, the thumping bass of the music, the overwhelming sense of invincibility that came with knowing nothing could touch him. He had been untouchable his whole life, surrounded by people who told him what he wanted to hear, who cleaned up his messes before he even noticed them. That night had been no different. A few too many drinks, a reckless decision, a moment of thrill that had spiraled into something much bigger than he had anticipated. He hadn't even thought twice when the cops pulled him over. He had laughed, joked, even offered them money to forget the whole thing. He had seen the flash of anger in their eyes, but he hadn't cared. Because nothing ever stuck to him, until now. The courtroom was so quiet that he could hear the faint tapping of a reporter's pen against her notepad. His chest felt tight, his confidence unraveling like a thread being pulled for an expensive suit. Judge Matthews adjusted his glasses, his face calm but unyielding. "It's time you learned what the real world looks like, Mr. Sinclair." Ethan's hands clenched into fists under the table. A sinking feeling spread through his stomach. For the first time in his life, money wasn't going to save him. And the worst part, he had no idea what was coming next. Ethan sat frozen, his mind spinning as the judge's words echoed through the courtroom. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, heavier than anything he had ever felt before. He had always been able to brush off consequences, to laugh them away or throw money at them until they disappeared. But something told him this time was different. This time, there was no easy way out. His father still hadn't moved. He sat in the front row, his expression carefully controlled, but Ethan knew him well enough to see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers tapped subtly against his knee. His father wasn't used to being powerless, and Ethan could tell he was already thinking of ways to fix this, to make it go away like every other problem before. But the judge's eyes didn't waver. He wasn't looking at Ethan's father. He was looking directly at Ethan, like he saw through all the bravado, all the arrogance, down to something Ethan himself didn't fully understand. Ethan swallowed, finally finding his voice. "Your Honor, I." The judge held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Mr. Sinclair, your words mean little when your actions have shown nothing but contempt for the law and for the people around you. You have lived in a world where rules don't apply to you, but that changes today." Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to walk in, pay a fine, make a few half-hearted apologies, and be done with it. Instead, he was watching the carefully constructed reality he had always lived in start to crack. He turned to his lawyer, hoping for some kind of reassurance, but Mr. Carlyle just gave him a tight-lipped look. This wasn't good. Even his lawyers, the best that money could buy, looked like they weren't sure how to fix this. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, some whispering into their phones. Ethan could practically feel the headlines writing themselves. Asterisk spoiled billionaire heir finally faces consequences. Asterisk, he clenched his fists under the table, his palms sweating. This wasn't just embarrassing. This was dangerous. Miss Caldwell, the prosecutor, cleared her throat. She had been watching Ethan closely, her sharp eyes taking in every detail, every twitch of his expression. "Your Honor, if I may," she said smoothly, glancing at the judge. He nodded, and she turned to Ethan. "Mr. Sinclair, do you even understand why you're here today?" Her voice was even, but there was a hint of something else beneath it, something almost personal. Ethan frowned, shifting in his seat. "Of course I do," he said, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "I made a mistake. I get it." Miss Caldwell didn't blink. "A mistake," she repeated. "Is that what you think this is? Just a mistake?" She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice just enough to draw everyone in. "Tell me, Mr. Sinclair, how many mistakes have you walked away from without consequence?" Ethan bristled. "That's not fair." She raised an eyebrow. "Isn't it? Let's review, shall we?" She turned toward the stack of papers in front of her and picked up one of the files. "In the past 5 years, you've been involved in multiple incidents: reckless driving, disorderly conduct, public intoxication. But every single time, the charges were dropped, settlements were made, and you walked away without so much as a slap on the wrist." Ethan felt his face heat up. You could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, judging him, waiting for his response. Miss Caldwell continued, flipping through the file. "And then there's this asterisk case, the one that brought you here today. But you don't seem to think it's serious. You've shown nothing but arrogance and disrespect. So let me ask you again, do you understand why you're here?" Ethan's jaw tightened. He wanted to snap back, to defend himself, but for the first time, he wasn't sure what to say. The judge watched the exchange carefully before finally speaking again. "Mr. Sinclair, your behavior in this courtroom alone has made it clear that you don't grasp the severity of your actions." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But you will." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Those words again, the way the judge said them, so calm and sure, sent a chill down his spine. His father finally moved, leaning forward slightly, as if he were about to say something. But the judge's eyes flickered to him, and just like that, he stopped. Even a man as powerful as Richard Sinclair knew when to stay silent. Ethan clenched his fists. He didn't like this. He didn't like feeling powerless. He had spent his whole life in control, calling the shots, knowing that no matter what, things would always work out in his favor. But this time, something felt different. The judge leaned forward slightly. "You think you can buy your way out of everything, Mr. Sinclair, but money won't help you now. Not this time." Ethan felt a cold sweat forming at the back of his neck. His mind raced through every possible outcome, every possible escape. But for the first time in his life, he couldn't see one. And that terrified him. Ethan's heartbeat pounded in his ears as the weight of the judge's words settled over him like a storm cloud. He had never felt fear like this before, real fear, the kind that twisted in his gut and made his skin crawl. He had always known deep down that money and power could shield him from anything. But now, sitting in his cold courtroom under the piercing gaze of Judge Matthews, he wasn't so sure anymore. His father shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening into a steeple beneath his chin. Richard Sinclair was a man used to pulling strings behind the scenes, fixing problems before they ever became real problems. But this time, Ethan could see it. His father had no control here. He was watching, waiting, and for the first time, Ethan suspected that even he didn't know how this was going to play out. Judge Matthews adjusted his glasses and let the silence stretch between them, making every second feel like an eternity. Then he spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "Mr. Sinclair, I have spent decades in this courtroom, witnessing lives destroyed by recklessness, arrogance, and entitlement. I have seen men and women walk in here believing they are untouchable. But in the end, they all learn the same lesson: no one is above the law." Ethan swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. The murmurs in the courtroom had faded, leaving only the deafening quiet, the kind that made everything feel heavier. He glanced at his lawyer, hoping for some kind of lifeline, but Mr. Carlyle didn't meet his eyes. Miss Caldwell stood again, her expression unreadable as she addressed the judge. "Your Honor, given Mr. Sinclair's history and his blatant disregard for the law, I believe a standard sentence would not be enough to make him understand the gravity of his actions." She paused, letting her words settle before turning her gaze to Ethan. "He needs to experience what real consequences feel like." Ethan tensed. His pulse quickened as the reality of what was happening began to crash down on him. This wasn't just another courtroom lecture. This wasn't just a fine he could pay or a settlement his father could arrange. This was something else, something much worse. The judge nodded slightly, as if he had already been considering the same thing. "I agree." Ethan's stomach turned. He could almost hear his father exhale sharply, the first real sign that even he was starting to worry. Judge Matthews leaned forward, his eyes locked on Ethan's. "You have spent your entire life surrounded by luxury, shielded from the consequences of your actions. You believe that your wealth makes you untouchable, but today you will learn otherwise." The courtroom was deathly silent. The tension in the air was suffocating. Ethan felt a cold sweat forming at the back of his neck. "Your Honor, please," he finally said, his voice quieter now, the confidence drained from it. "I understand. I get it." The judge's expression remained steady. "No, Mr. Sinclair, you don't, but you will." His lawyer finally spoke up, standing quickly. "Your Honor, we request a moment to discuss this." The judge cut him off with a single sharp glance. "Mr. Carlyle, your client had every opportunity to take his case seriously. Instead, he has treated this courtroom like an inconvenience. That ends today." Ethan's breathing grew shallow. His hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He could feel everything slipping away, faster than he could catch it. He turned again, this time fully facing his father. He expected reassurance, expected to see the same calm, unshakable confidence that had been there his entire life. But instead, he saw something else. For the first time in his life, Ethan saw uncertainty in his father's face. Panic shot through him like ice in his veins. This couldn't be happening. He wasn't supposed to lose. Judge Matthews picked up his gavel, holding it steady in his hand as he prepared to deliver the final blow. "Mr. Sinclair, I hereby sentence you to..." Ethan didn't hear the rest. His ears were ringing, his vision blurred. And then the gavel came down. The sharp crack of the gavel echoed through the courtroom, but Ethan barely heard it. His pulse was a deafening roar in his ears. His body felt frozen, locked in place as if time itself had paused. But the judge's voice cut through the haze like a knife. Mr. Sinclair, you are hereby sentenced to 6 months of community service under direct supervision in a rehabilitation program. Ethan blinked, his mind struggling to catch up. A rehabilitation program. That didn't make sense. He wasn't some kind of addict or criminal. He was just a guy who had made a mistake. A mistake that, in any other situation, would have been forgotten by now. A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Even the reporters, who had been furiously taking notes all morning, seemed caught off guard. His lawyer turned to him quickly, whispering, "We can appeal this. Don't react." But Ethan wasn't listening. His whole body was stiff, every muscle tensed like a rubber band stretched too tight. Judge Matthews continued, his face unreadable. "This will not be the kind of service you can write off as a minor inconvenience, Mr. Sinclair. You will work in a facility for individuals who have been directly impacted by reckless behavior. You will face the consequences of actions like your own every single day." Ethan felt the weight of those words hit him like a punch to the stomach. This wasn't just some minor punishment, something he could fake his way through. He was being forced to confront the exact kind of people he had spent his life ignoring. He opened his mouth to protest, to say something, but before he could, his father stood abruptly. "Your Honor," Richard Sinclair said, his voice calm but firm, "I respectfully request a moment to speak." The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Judge Matthews studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Make it brief." Ethan turned to his father, expecting him to argue, to push back, to make this all disappear. But instead, his father exhaled slowly and looked directly at the judge. "I won't argue with your ruling," he said. Ethan's stomach dropped. He snapped his head toward his father, disbelief flashing in his eyes. What was he saying? Richard Sinclair continued, "I've spent years trying to protect my son, covering for him, shielding him from the real world. But perhaps that was my mistake." His gaze flickered to Ethan, and for the first time, there was something unfamiliar in his expression. Disappointment, resignation. Ethan's throat went dry. His father turned back to the judge. "I trust your decision," he said simply before sitting down again. Ethan's entire body tensed. His father, his most powerful ally, wasn't going to fight for him. He was letting this happen. The realization sent a wave of cold panic through him. He had always known his father had limits, but he had never thought he'd reach them. The judge nodded and turned back to Ethan. Then it settled. Ethan's mind was spinning. He clenched his fists beneath the table, his breathing shallow. The walls of the courtroom suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. He had never felt this helpless in his entire life. But just as he was coming to terms with what was happening, Miss Caldwell stepped forward again, flipping through another file. "Your Honor, before we finalize the terms, there's one more matter we need to discuss." Ethan's stomach twisted. What more could there possibly be? Judge Matthews raised an eyebrow. "Proceed." Miss Caldwell glanced at Ethan before continuing. "There was an additional witness statement submitted this morning, one that changes certain aspects of this case." A new wave of whispers swept through the courtroom. Ethan stiffened. Witness statement? Who else had something to say about him? Miss Caldwell pulled out a document and handed it to the judge. "Your Honor, the victim from the night of the incident has requested to make a statement." Ethan's breath hitched. Victim. He hadn't thought of it like that. And then the doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and the room fell completely silent. A woman stepped inside, her posture stiff, her eyes locked straight ahead. Ethan had never seen her before, but the moment their eyes met, something inside him twisted. She wasn't just some stranger. She was here because of him. Ethan's chest tightened as the woman walked toward the front of the courtroom. Every step she took felt like a drumbeat echoing in his head. He had no idea who she was, but the way she carried herself, the quiet determination in her eyes, sent a chill through him. She wasn't here for show. She was here for justice. Judge Matthews motioned for her to step forward. "Please state your name for the record." She adjusted the microphone and took a steady breath. "My name is Olivia Carter." The name didn't ring any bells, but before Ethan could process it, Miss Caldwell spoke again. Miss Carter was directly affected by Mr. Sinclair's actions on the night of the incident. Ethan frowned, confused. He had been reckless, sure, but he didn't remember hurting anyone. Wait, what? The judge shot him a warning look, and Ethan forced himself to stay quiet. His heart pounded as Olivia looked straight at him. There was no anger in her expression, no hatred, just something far worse: disappointment. "I was in the car behind you that night," Olivia said, her voice steady but firm. "When you sped through that red light, you didn't just put yourself in danger, you nearly crashed into me." Ethan's stomach dropped. She took another breath. "I had just picked up my younger brother from his part-time job. He was in the passenger seat. We were heading home." Her voice wavered slightly, but she kept going. "I had to slam on my brakes so hard that we skidded into the intersection. A truck coming from the other direction swerved to avoid us and ended up hitting a light pole instead." She clenched her hands together. "The driver was injured. My brother was shaken up for weeks." She hesitated, her voice softer now. "And you didn't even notice." Ethan's hands gripped the edge of the table. He had no memory of this. That night had been a blur of flashing lights, laughter, and the rush of knowing he could get away with anything. But here was a stranger, standing in front of him, telling him that his recklessness had nearly destroyed her life. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. He could feel everyone's eyes on him, waiting for a reaction. But for the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. Olivia exhaled and looked at the judge. "I'm not here to ask for a harsher sentence," she said, her voice softer now. "I just needed him to understand. To see what he almost did." She turned back to Ethan. "Because if you don't, you'll do it again. And next time someone might not be so lucky." Her words hit harder than any punishment the judge could hand down. They settled deep in his chest, in the part of him that had always believed he was untouchable. Judge Matthews studied Ethan carefully before speaking. "Do you have anything to say, Mr. Sinclair?" Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. The arrogance, the bravado, none of it mattered anymore. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about how to get out of this. He was thinking about the people he had hurt. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. I didn't know. It sounded weak, pathetic even, but it was the truth. I didn't realize." Olivia held his gaze. "Now you do." The judge let the moment settle before he continued. "Mr. Sinclair, your sentence remains as ordered. 6 months of community service in a rehabilitation program." He paused, then added, "But you'll also spend that time working with victims of reckless driving." Ethan barely had time to react before the judge continued. "And one more thing." His expression was unreadable. "Miss Carter will be the one overseeing your progress." The air left Ethan's lungs. He glanced at Olivia, expecting shock, but she didn't even flinch. It was clear she had known this was coming. Judge Matthews nodded once. "Court is adjourned." The gavel struck, and just like that, Ethan's world changed forever. Ethan sat frozen as the reality of his situation sank in. The courtroom was emptying, people filing out, murmuring to each other about what had just happened. But he stayed in his seat, staring at the table in front of him, his mind replaying Olivia's words over and over again. He had spent his whole life believing he could walk away from anything. That money, connections, and the right last name would always be enough to smooth over his mistakes. But this time, there was no way out. No deal to be made, no favor to be called in. He wasn't just serving time. He was about to face the very people his recklessness had hurt. His father stood beside him, straightening his jacket. "Let's go." Ethan turned to him, searching for some kind of reassurance, some promise that he would fix this. But Richard Sinclair only looked at him for a moment before shaking his head. "This is on you now," he said simply, then walked toward the exit. A sinking feeling settled in Ethan's chest. His father wasn't going to interfere. He really was on his own. A movement in the corner of his eye pulled his attention. Olivia was still there, watching him. She didn't say anything, just gave him a small nod before turning to leave. Ethan exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands over his face. 6 months. It felt like a lifetime. The first day at the rehabilitation center was nothing like he expected. He had assumed it would be a place filled with people who barely noticed him, another obligation he could coast through until his time was up. But the moment he walked in, reality hit him like a brick wall. The center was a quiet, serious place, nothing like the world he was used to. The halls smelled like antiseptic and coffee, and every conversation seemed to carry the weight of something unspoken. These weren't just people working off community service hours. They were people whose lives had been shattered by drunk drivers, reckless accidents, moments of carelessness that changed everything. Olivia met him at the entrance, holding a clipboard. "You're assigned to work in recovery support," she said, handing him a schedule. "You'll help with physical therapy sessions, talk to the patients, and assist wherever needed." Ethan glanced at the schedule. It was packed from morning to night. No shortcuts, no easy way out. He sighed, stuffing the paper into his pocket. "Right, so where do I start?" Olivia studied him for a moment, then motioned for him to follow. "Come on, there's someone I want you to meet." She led him down a hallway and into a small therapy room. Inside, a man in his 40s sat in a wheelchair, his face calm but his eyes sharp. "This is Daniel," Olivia said. "He was the driver of the truck that swerved to avoid hitting me that night." Ethan felt his stomach drop. Daniel looked him over, then gave a small nod. "So you're the kid who nearly got me killed." Ethan's throat tightened. He had no idea what to say. Daniel chuckled dryly. "Relax. I'm not here to make your life miserable. That's already handled." He gestured to the wheelchair. "Lost the use of my left leg, but I'm alive. Could have been worse." Ethan shifted on his feet. I didn't know." Daniel tilted his head. "You didn't care asterisk." The words hit harder than Ethan expected. There was no anger in Daniel's voice, no bitterness, just a quiet truth that was somehow worse. Ethan had spent so much time making excuses for himself, blaming bad luck or people who didn't understand him. But standing here, in front of a man whose life had changed forever because of his actions, he realized something awful. He had never cared about anyone but himself. Daniel sighed, stretching his arms. "You'll be working with me during therapy. Hope you don't mind getting your hands dirty." Ethan swallowed. "Yeah, okay." For the first time in his life, he had no choice but to face the consequences of his actions. The first few weeks were brutal. Every morning he was up at dawn, helping patients move, listening to their stories, seeing the way their lives had been altered in ways they never expected. It wasn't just physical injuries. It was the way they spoke about their dreams, the jobs they lost, the moments with family they could never get back. And the hardest part, none of them looked at him with hate. He had expected them to resent him, to see him as nothing more than a spoiled rich kid who had gotten off easy. But instead, they treated him like anyone else, expected him to work, to show up, to listen. It was Olivia who pushed him the hardest. She never let him slack off, never gave him an easy way out. But over time, he realized it wasn't because she wanted to punish him. It was because she wanted him to understand. One afternoon, after a long day, Ethan sat outside on the center's steps, staring at the setting sun. Olivia sat down next to him, silent for a moment before she finally spoke. "You're different now," she said. Ethan let out a slow breath. "I hope so." She turned to look at him. "What happens when this is over?" Ethan didn't answer right away. 6 months ago, he would have laughed off this entire experience, walked away without a second thought. But now, the idea of going back to his old life, the parties, the meaningless distractions, felt empty. He looked at Olivia, then back at the horizon. "I don't know," he admitted. But I know I don't want to be that guy again. She studied him for a moment before nodding. Good. As the sun dipped lower, Ethan realized that this was just the beginning. He couldn't erase the past. He couldn't undo the damage he had caused, but he could choose what kind of person he was going to be moving forward. For the first time in his life, he was ready to make that choice.